What is going on, everyone? Thank you so much for tuning in today. Welcome back into the Fan Committee Football Podcast. I am one of your hosts, Joe Toon, joined by Michael Herrera. Mike, we haven't been doing the pod really all year this year. We're busy guys. We're seniors in college. We're trying to figure out what we're going to do with the rest of our lives. But guess what? The NFL playoffs means we're bringing you a pod. We're ready to talk football. Mike, are you excited for these NFL playoffs? How you doing today?
I'm doing great. I'm really excited. I think honestly, this is one of the playoffs where I think probably all of the best teams in the league made it. I know always there's some year where someone makes it in because of weird seeding stuff, but I think this is a really good playoff bracket. I'm really excited to see how it goes. So I think it's going to be great playoffs this year.
Yeah, mercifully, to your point, I mean, the Atlanta Falcons did not sneak into the playoffs. Your Dolphins did not sneak into the playoffs. So I think we were spared from some nonsense that we've seen in years past, like you said.
Mm-hmm.
I think this is a really interesting crop of teams as well, because I don't really think there's a clear favorite as opposed to some other years in either conference. I think in the NFC, as we can talk about, I think there's a few really clear-cut top teams. Then the AFC, I think it's really wide open. So to get right into it, starting with the first game of round one of the NFL playoffs, the Los Angeles Chargers are going to go on the road to face the number 4 seed, the Houston Texans, who before the year, we actually got to do a preview of the Chargers. We fit that in before the year, and we agreed that we didn't think they were going to be a playoff team despite the hiring of Jim Harbaugh. We were very much wrong. All the things that we talked about, maybe 1 or 2 years down the line, this is what this Chargers team could look like. That's what they did as soon as the very first year of this Harbaugh era. And they're going to go on the road to face a Houston team that's been pretty bad, I would say, over the second half of the season, despite their record. So, Mike, what are you thinking in this game? Who you got and why? What are you thinking?
To me, I think a lot of people, it's easy to just be like, oh, well, Texans are the 4 seed, they're high seed, they're probably the better team. But I honestly think it's going to be the Chargers. I think the Texans have looked really bad the back half of the season. I think they've been really up and down. And I think that's obviously due to the fact that they've lost Stephon Diggs. They've lost Tank Dell, who's going to be out most of next year, too. It's obviously they've been decimated by injuries, but the team's been pretty up and down. CJ Stroud's unfortunately having kind of a sophomore slump. I think it's bound to happen. Once you have a good rookie season, people are going to kind of figure out what's happening. And I think we all kind of took the success they had last year for granted. And I think we should have been a little more cautiously optimistic about them instead of being like, this is like a Super Bowl contending team. And I think most people got kind of caught up in that, unfortunately. But I think the Chargers have really gotten it together. Even though the fact that they don't really have great receiving targets, Vlad McConkey's been incredible, and the team's playing really well outside of that. Their defense is pretty good. The run game has been fairly efficient, even though they've been kind of rotating random running backs half the time. They're pretty good. They've kind of done the opposite of the Texans. They've kind of rounded into form, while the Texans have kind of just crumbled and kind of limping into the postseason.
Yeah, I agree. I think the Chargers have, especially in the second half of the year, really started to look like a team that I'm even open to the idea of them making the Super Bowl. I'm not necessarily saying they're going to do that, but the first half of the year they were good. Definitely was already exceeding my expectations, but I think they've really taken care of business down the stretch here. And it starts with, their run attack, like you said. I mean, Dobbins was out for a bit, but now he's expected to be back for this game. He's questionable. But with him behind that great offensive line, and then you have Herbert, who has all the time in the world to get the ball to his receivers. Quentin Johnston, didn't he have I think he had 180 yards in week 18 out of nowhere. Big game for him. I think they're going to have a pretty easy time with this Texans team. They're used to going on the road. They're used to not having the strongest home field advantage. Yeah, I definitely think they're going to clean up this one as well. I think they could win by multiple scores. And like you said with Houston, I mean, the injuries to the wide receivers, I think at least play partially into why CJ Stroud's had such a down year. Their offensive line is also really underperformed. They're bottom 5 in the league in sacks allowed. They're giving up a lot of sacks. And yeah, I just think that Chargers pass rushes, even though Khalil Mack doesn't have the prolific season he did last year, I think across the board, that entire front seven is going to have a fairly easy time getting to CJ Stroud in this game. So I agree. I think the Chargers win this one. They'll move on, and that would mean they would probably face the Chiefs in round 1, unless one of us thinks one of these lower seeds in the AFC is going to take the win. And speaking of the AFC, we have the Steelers going on the road to face the Ravens in the second game of round 1. These two teams, obviously division rivals, they split the season series. The first game, the Steelers won 18-16 in Pittsburgh. They dominated the time of possession in that game. Last time, it was in Baltimore. Derrick Henry ran all over the Steelers. It was a much more decisive game, 34-17. These teams know each other so well. Just what is your expectation in this game? How do you think it's going to play out in the tiebreaker?
I think this game, unfortunately, is going to be like, I think it's going to be one of those lame playoff games. I think it's going to be an ugly game. I think that's kind of the issue is that even though the Ravens, I think, are very clearly the much better team than the Steelers, because they're these division rivals, it's very historic, just like gritty teams they kind of play down to each other or play up in certain cases, and so it kind of becomes this weird back and forth with them. Like you're saying, they split the series this year. I think the Ravens should win this game just because I think they're the better team top to bottom. But I wouldn't be surprised if either it's a really ugly, low scoring game or the Steelers somehow manage to kind of squeak one out the way they did the first year. So this one's really up in the air to me. I think the Ravens should win, but I think it's going to be a weird game to me.
Yeah, and I'm definitely going to ride with the Ravens as well, who before the year I had as my AFC Super Bowl representative. I'm still open to it. I think Henry and Lamar have been such a dynamic tandem all season. I do think their offense is really, especially in the second half of the season, they've had their up and downs this year, but I still feel like they're one of the better offenses in that AFC playoff field. The Steelers to me just don't have enough guys. Like and I'm going to talk about this with the Packers soon. Like the Steelers just have a lot of solid, okay players. Even though the Ravens have underperformed both on defense and in special teams on the season, I just don't think the Steelers have the talent, really, almost at any position, quarterback, receiver, even in the secondary to a degree. I don't think they have enough to go deep in the playoffs. And this has kind of been the book on them. How many years now? 5 years, 6 years? This is kind of how it always is with them.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it'll be that way as well this year. They almost they had a chance to win the division and get a bit of an easier playoff matchup, but instead they wound up, losing that second game to Baltimore, and now they're gonna have to go on the road. So yeah, I do think Baltimore takes care of it here.
I agree. I think, especially like even when you look at like the last game they played, Bengals Steelers, like
Yeah.
they could have easily won that game at any point, but they just could not move the ball against a really bad Bengals defense.
Mhm.
So it was kind of just like their only weapon is George Pickens, and he hasn't. Well, I mean they have Fryermuth, but he unfortunately dropped like a
Yeah, that was
crucial fourth
big
down, which is
drop.
unfortunate for him. Like Fryermuth's pretty consistent, but you can't expect the tight end to be like the sole part of your offense. And Pickens has been like horrendous. Like he went into the last game of the season trying to break 1,000, and he ended up losing yardage. So he actually dropped his season total, which is kind of funny.
Oh, man.
So I don't know, and Najee Harris, like he got banged up in that game, he might not play, so that's a whole thing. And it's just they really could not move the ball against even a bad defense, and the Ravens are a much better defense than that. And I think it's pretty evident by the fact that they ended up winning the second matchup between them. I think the Ravens kind of rounded into form at the end of the year the same way a lot of teams usually do. I think it's pretty often we see from the best teams they perfect what they're doing. And when they lost to the Steelers, that was earlier in the year. You're still trying to figure things out, and I think they realized you just got to run Derrick Henry a lot, and I think that's kind of their key to victory. But I think they need to be careful with the Steelers because sometimes the Steelers, they're a weird team, but I think Ravens should clear them out. So
Yeah, we're in agreement with that. Yeah, the Steelers, they're gonna have to figure some sort of pivot, but we say this every year, and they never do it. So I think, yeah, I agree with you. We can save any more Steelers talk for another time, but I agree in this season, I don't think the Steelers have what it takes. So the final AFC matchup, I'm really interested in this one actually, even though I think a lot of people are gonna think this is a really obvious pick. But I actually think Denver, I'm not going to say they're going to beat Buffalo, but I think this could be, as long as it's not like snowing like 5, 6 inches on the field, I do think Denver's going to be able to put up a fight in this game. Because if you look at what the Broncos have been able to do this year on defense, I do think they have what it takes to kind of give the Bills some trouble. And the Bills' defense isn't anything to write home about either. Now, I do think the talent of Buffalo should be enough for them to win this game. But I think it could be a one-score game. Do you agree with that, or do you think it's going to be a lot more decisive in
no,
Buffalo?
I actually agree. When I was, like we were kind of like doing the research for this episode, I was kind of thinking the same thing. I was like, a lot of people are going to think because of the Bills, because they're one of the best teams, top three in the league right now, that's going to be easy win for them. But I think Bo Nix, when he plays really well, he's incredibly efficient. He throws the ball well. He's a very dual threat quarterback at times. Like I think Buffalo has to be careful with that, especially because like I know it was the last game of the season and it didn't really matter to the Buffalo Bills, but they still let Joe Milton carve them up.
Yeah.
And I think you need to be careful with that. Not that that like is indicative of anything, but I think that you have to be careful with a team like this. Like you have to take the Broncos seriously because when the Broncos play well, they're a very good team. And
Mhm.
I do agree with you. I think it'll be a one-score game. It could honestly go either way. It should be the Bills, like you said, because they're the better team. But it gets tricky because the Broncos, they're probably going to give them a good fight, or at least that's the hope. I personally, big Bo Nix fan, so I hope that he plays well at the least, even if they do lose. But I agree. I think the Buffalo Bills need to take them seriously. I don't think it's as free as a win as some other people seem to think.
For sure. And the matchup I was interested in looking at the overall stats, the Bills were the only team in the league this year to give up less than one sack per game, but that Broncos pass rush has been elite all season. I mean, their entire defense has been elite, but that's especially what I'll be interested to see because it's Denver going. They'll be in the cold, but Denver's not exactly LA. It's not like they've never experienced cold either over there. So I think this could be a really I think this could be the best game of the week. Like I think
Mhm.
this could be the best round one game if the Broncos are at their best. I definitely think that could come to pass. But yeah, I'm with you. I still think this is a year where the Bills are going to go deep in the playoffs, but I do think they'll be tested in round one.
No, I agree. I think they need to especially be careful with Nick Bonito. I think he's like
Mhm.
really that X factor on the Broncos defense. He's incredible. When he gets going, he's really good. Honestly, most of their linebackers are really good. They have a
Yeah,
really good linebacking
yeah,
core. It's incredible. Their edge rush is great. So I think they just really need to try to hone in on that and keep things moving, or otherwise it's going to get real ugly real fast for the Bills. So
agreed. So, and one team it's going to get ugly for, I think, is my Green Bay Packers when they visit Philadelphia in the 2 versus 7 matchup. Yes, the Packers did win as the 7th seed last year against Dallas. I think this is a much different type of opponent, though, in this Philadelphia team. You got Saquon Barkley, who's been, I honestly think there's a case that he's still the MVP, even at this stage in the year. I know some people are like, no, no, no. Josh Allen said, and Lamar had such prolific seasons, you have to give it to a quarterback. I don't know the next time we're seeing a running back put forth the type of year Saquon just did. That alone scares me. But the Packers have a lot of injuries. They also just, besides Josh Jacobs and Xavier McKinney and Jordan Love on a good day, I don't really think the Packers have a lot of just blue chip, top 10 at their position type guys. And that is where the Eagles, I think, just run away with this matchup because the Eagles have a ton of talent everywhere. Uh, do you think I'm not saying the Packers are going to get like absolutely demolished. Like I wrote down 34-20 is around what I was thinking the Eagles would win this game by. I got some Eagles friends and family saying, no, no, we're not looking past the Packers. I'm not saying you should look past them, but what as a not as a non-fan, am I being too critical of how the Packers have played over the past month? Do you think this is going to be a better game than I'm anticipating?
not no, I kind of agree with you, unfortunately, and not to like disrespect the Packers or like I'm
No,
not,
they deserve it.
not a fan of either team, obviously, unfortunately Dolphins fan. But I think the Eagles. It's kind of funny because at one point in the year we were discussing when are they firing Sirianni at the end of the year
Right.
because they had a few ugly losses. But the Eagles have really like kicked it up a notch. They're really like they're chugging along. Like they're a very good team. They figured out whatever was going on with like Hurts and Brown and just Sirianni in the locker room. Like they got all that sorted and they were a really good football team.
Mhm.
And I kind of agree with you. Like Jordan Love's good, but sometimes he's really up and down still. Like he's still trying to iron that out. And besides Josh Jacobs, the receivers very up and down as well. So I definitely get where you're coming from. I understand kind of the concern because at the end of the day, even like the Packers lost to like the Bears, and maybe the Packers kind of gave up on that game because Jordan Love he had to leave early with an injury, and that's also a concern is that Jordan Love had to leave with an injury. You don't want to make sure that he's not getting banged up, especially against a good Eagles defense. I agree. I think the Eagles are going to pretty handily beat the Packers, but I don't think it's going to be like a blowout. Like I don't. The Packers will put up their points.
Well, we know what they'll do if they're going to follow the formula they did of every other game they played against NFC playoff teams this year. They're going to go down like 3 scores, and then the fourth quarter score like 20 points, and then it will look like it was a much closer game. Because that's what they did all year against the Lions, the Vikings. Even that Week 1 game against the Eagles was close, but they wound up losing it. Yeah, I don't know. To me, the fact that the Packers were a blocked field goal away from 0-6 in the division, yet they still would have made the playoffs even if they did lose that other Bears game. that's just, or maybe not. Maybe Seattle would have had a tiebreaker. I'm not quite sure, but the fact that they still would have been, an above 500 team with an 0-6 division record, it leaves me really confused on how to evaluate this Packers team as a fan, just looking for the future. But in this game specifically, I mean, without Jair, who's been hurt for a while, but we have no one to cover those two receivers. We don't really have anyone to cover Goddard either. I'm not very confident. I do think this is gonna take Jordan Love having a really and Josh Jacobs having really really good games to keep pace offensively because I don't think this will be. I don't really think there's a scenario where the Packers are able to contain the Eagles' offense. It would have to be the Packers keeping pace with the Eagles' offense.
No, I definitely agree because like the same way you said like how are you guys going to stop AJ Brown, Goddard, and Devonta Smith? How are like the receivers on the Packers going to get open against DeJean and
Yeah.
even like Sidney Brown has been really good this year even though he got injured recently, which is unfortunate. Like
Mm-hmm.
they're a very good defense, so I definitely get that. Like you have to keep pace offensively, but will you be able to do that against such a good defense? It's really tough to tell. So I definitely
Yeah.
understand where that kind of like pessimism is coming from.
Yeah, and the last thing, like Christian Watson just tore his ACL, which sucks. Like he's had a lot of injuries, but this is obviously the most severe. And people make jokes about Christian Watson, like he's. I'm not saying he's an elite talent, but he stretches the field. He at the very least attracts defensive attention. Without him, like you said, I don't know how the Packers receivers are even going to get open because it's like Jaden Reed hasn't really been doing that for really since October at this point. So I don't know. I'm in off season mode, and I think the team is too. So I don't know. That's all the Packers tangents I'll give for now. But I definitely think the Eagles will take care of business, and then we can talk about what they'll look like in the future rounds. But one game I think is going to be really close, and I told you before we started, I wasn't even sure who I wanted to pick in this game quite yet. Commanders at Tampa. Commanders obviously had a crazy surprise season with Jaden Daniels being the rookie of the year front runner. The offense has been great. Even the defense is kind of overachieved to a degree. Tampa, like I said at the top, almost lost their playoff spot to Atlanta, but I would say they took care of business down the stretch in December for the most part, and have definitely started to find their groove offensively. What are you thinking with this game? Because I think this is going to be a close one.
I agree. I think a lot of people are going into this thinking like, "Oh, it's Jay Daniels, their young team. It's kind of going to be an easy one for the Bucks." And though I do think the Bucks will and should win this game, I think people are forgetting that when they played Week 1, the only reason that game wasn't closer was because their kicker missed like 4 field goals.
Oh, that's
Like that
right.
game like was going to be, I think it was like a ended up being like a 13-point difference, but it could have shaved it down to like a 4-point difference. Like if they had made some of those field goals, and
Yeah,
it's not meant to be like, oh, moral victories are important. But like, they like the teams were more evenly matched than I think people would think, and I think that stays about the same.
yeah,
My concern is just that like there have been games this season where Jan Daniels, although of course he's been electric, super incredible, I think personally, offensive rookie of the year, and I think for most people he should be. There has been a few games where he's been a little up and down, and I think against a really good Bucks defense, I think the Bucks defense, they keep teams a little humble sometimes. I think obviously, especially with like really good D line with like Vita Vea on it. I think they have to be really careful with that, especially since the Commanders' run game is pretty up and down sometimes too. So I think if you don't have that run game, like if you don't set the run game early to kind of support Jane Daniels, I think it's going to be a little tricky. But I do think it should be a good game because I think offensively these are both very good teams. But I do think ultimately I'm going to pick the Bucks because I think they've been here before. They know what they're doing, and they should be able to take advantage of any rookie mistakes that happen because there's a lot of rookie starters on the Commanders, and I think that's
yeah.
where the veteran difference kind of comes into play.
Yeah, I agree with you. I'm gonna go with Tampa, and I think if it was in Washington, and Washington did have a better record, but obviously it goes by division, I would probably have at least considered it. But I think you make a great point. Like, there's a lot of guys who won a Super Bowl on this team still. There's Todd Bowles has been a coach for a very long time, and Washington has experienced coaches as well. But like you said, a lot of young players on that team. I think your point about the run game was also notable. Brian Robinson, when he's not banged up, if he is banged up, then they got to put in Nichols and Rodriguez. Like these aren't proven guys. And Tampa still has a great front seven, a great overall defense. So I'm gonna go with Tampa as well. Last year they beat the Eagles, bit of an upset, went further than people thought. That's in play again. Like I think this team, Baker Mayfield had a great year, Bucky Irving is awesome. Like he's not even going to be a top 5 rookie of the year guy probably, but like he was awesome this year. Evans is just hit 1,000 yards again. Jalen McMillan just filling in for Chris Godwin has been a revelation. So yeah, I think this team has what it takes to beat a younger team in Washington, even with how great Jane Daniels has been. So Joel Haas, I'm sorry, but it is only year one. Bright future ahead for the Commanders. Last round one game before we can kind of give like our overall predictions for what will follow. Rams hosting the Vikings. Vikings coming off a decisive loss to Detroit in what was like, built up as the matchup of week 18. And it was a bit of a letdown in terms of its primetime slot. Despite that, do you still think the Vikings have what it takes to have a deep playoff run, or where are you kind of sitting with this?
I think this is like my hot take is that I think the Rams can very feasibly beat the Vikings. And it's kind of unfortunate because the Vikings were a really good team, and I still think they're one of the best. But I think when what we saw against the Lions was that a really good defense had them kind of scared. Sam Darnold looked like Jets Sam Darnold, unfortunately. And not to take away from the fact that Sam Darnold's been incredible this season. He's been incredible. I'm really happy for him that he's bounced back this way. But he was jittery. He was overthrowing guys left and right. The offense wasn't able to move at all. The Lions defense had them locked up. And I think the Rams defense is pretty underrated. I think they have a lot of really good guys. Even if you look at Jared Versk and Braden Fisk, the rookies they brought in, or even Kitchens at safety, who's been really good, I I just really like their defense, and we saw that's what happened in the last game. The defense gave them fits, and the Vikings couldn't really do anything unless they were able to control the game offensively the way they wanted to. And if they can't, we saw that it wasn't really working otherwise. And so that's kind of my concern with them. And, I think the Rams are a little better than people seem to think, because I think offensively they've been a little up and down sometimes, but I think their defense is really good. And I think the Vikings really need to take this game seriously. They need to make sure that Sam Darnold has his head right for this game, because if he's jittery again like he was in that last game, I'm very concerned that the Vikings could easily be like down 3 touchdowns at some point.
I would love to see the Vikings once again lose a lot earlier than people expect. The Giants did this to them 2 years ago. It's obviously, a tradition in Vikings franchise history to underperform in the playoffs. Uh, I hear your argument. I'm gonna pick the Vikings still because I just think what they did in the regular season still has to mean something even after a loss to a really good Detroit team. But I agree with you. Darnold has had a few games this year where if he is under a little more pressure than he's used to, and the Vikings have done a great job keeping pressure off of him. They've done a really good job balancing the run and the pass, things like that all year has made things, have allowed Darnold to kind of at least somewhat fulfill his potential this year. But I do think the Rams, like you said, have played a lot better. I think people don't fully realize it either, that this Rams team plays a lot differently than the previous couple of years Rams teams. Like you said, they're kind of have been more of a rely on your defense, rely on the run game than they have been in previous years, because at first I think everyone kind of wrote it off as like Puka and Cooper Kupp were hurt. But since they've been back, the Rams have still struggled to score points. But that's kind of why I'm still going to pick against them, because as much as I trust Sean McVay and even Stafford, who obviously won a Super Bowl, they've just been uneven to me. I mean, Cooper Kupp cost me a fantasy championship by getting 0 points. But then there was the Arizona game. They only scored 13, and Arizona's defense ain't nothing to write home about. So I still think if the Rams aren't able to play like the Rams from 2 years ago, what have you, or even last year with Puka, the Vikings offense has been just way too, top notch for me to give the Rams the benefit of the doubt there. But I do think you're right. I think there's a world where this game is maybe it is a Rams-ish type game where it is a low scoring game, and Darnold has some issues. But I do think talent wise, Minnesota still gets this done. I'm going to give them one playoff win before they have the rug yanked from under them.
Yeah, no, that's definitely understandable. It's more that I just think that it gets complicated with coaches and experience, and I think that there's got to be one game that's going to go completely differently than we expect, and I think this is the game where it's closest to that happening. I just think in terms of how we've seen how uneven the Vikings could be, and how we've seen how great defensively the Rams can be at times. And I think if those two coincide, I think we could see the Rams win, which is why I think that. So that's kind of like what I'm looking at. But I also definitely understand that like the Vikings have still been an incredible team this year, not to take away from like the fact that they've been great and Sam Darnold's been incredible. Like they're a very good team. Obviously, they've played well to their record. It's just that if like playoff jitters and a good Rams defensive performance coincide, I think it's going to be a rough game for them.
Yeah, I think that's definitely fair, and I think you're right in thinking like there's always a surprise result. Honestly, if I had to pick an upset, I might, like I said earlier, I might lean Denver over Buffalo. I think I'm a little more confident in that than the Rams, but I like how you're thinking. I definitely think there's a case for it. So just kind of looking at the rest of the playoffs. I mean, we don't need to go game by game because we obviously don't know what's officially going to happen. But kind of looking at the one seeds, at the bracket here, Detroit would be playing based off our predictions. They'd be playing the winner of that Rams and Vikings game. I think Detroit would beat Minnesota again. I think obviously there's the storyline with Goff and Stafford. I think either way, I would rock with Detroit. They're for all the defensive injuries they've had, and that they continue to pile up. Terry Arnold got hurt in that Vikings game. I think someone else might have got hurt as well. But offensively, they're just a monster, and you just can't stop anything about their offense right now. And I think it's at least going to take them to the NFC title game.
No, that's definitely understandable. Me personally, like I'm going to keep the rest of my prediction simple. I think the Super Bowl is going to end up being Detroit versus Buffalo. I think these are clearly the two best teams in the league, just in terms of being well-rounded teams. And obviously the Bills, they kind of have their nightmare scenario of they would have to probably play the Chiefs because at the end of the day, Chiefs are probably going to make the championship at some point. And but I think like in terms of like how people are saying you can't count out the Chiefs, I think this has definitely been like their worst year. Like out of like these recent years where they're kind of like iffy teams, like this is I think definitely their worst year. Like they've had some really close games against some pretty bad teams at times, and I think this might be the year Buffalo can finally overcome the Chiefs. And
Mm-hmm.
I think it's going to be Detroit versus Buffalo. I think they're easily the best teams, and I hope that's going to be the Super Bowl because I think they had a pretty good game when they played during the regular season, so I'd love to see that
Yeah,
again.
that was a game where those two teams' defensive issues came to a front, but the elite offenses came to play. That was a really fun one. But that's kind of a reason that I'm picking the Bills as well to win the AFC. I am a little concerned about the unevenness of their defense, but I also think you could say the same about Baltimore, and then you could say, like you said, kind of about the Chiefs' offense is kind of uneven. So I think there's question marks for all three of those top AFC teams. I'm going to go with the Bills because I think it's time. I think it's about time that Josh Allen got over that hump, and you could say the same about Lamar, but I do trust the Bills overall, just how they performed all season long, where the Ravens have had a lot of hiccups throughout the way. So I agree with you. I think Buffalo wins the AFC. I think the Eagles are going to beat Detroit. I really do. I know Detroit's going to be at home, but I do think the Eagles defense is in such a better spot than Detroit right now, just with the injuries, but even just how they're performing. I trust the Eagles secondary more than Detroit's. The offense, Detroit still probably has the better structured offense, but Saquon, you have no clue. Just Saquon has never played in a playoff game. Or wait, no, that's not true. He played in with the Giants against Minnesota. I made that up. But it feels like Saquon has never played meaningful playoff games, and I think he's going to be ready to go for this playoff run. I really want to see how he does against Detroit because Detroit relies so much on their balanced offense. It's going to come down to how Hurts plays in that game, because I think Saquon will show up. I think the Eagles are going to need to find a way to match that type of balance Detroit brings to the table. I don't know. I think they're going to be able to do it though. The Eagles have obviously made the Super Bowl before with Hurts. I think they're going to be able to do it. I think they're the better team with the current state of Detroit's health.
Mhm. Yeah, that's understandable. I definitely get where you're coming from with that, especially because, like you said, the defensive just injuries that have just decimated the Lions, and not to use injuries as an excuse because you always have to be well prepared for these things, but their defense just hasn't played as well as they could be because they're losing a lot of the key players. And a team like the Eagles, who's really good offensively, especially explosive at times, you have to be careful with that kind of stuff. So I definitely understand where that sentiment comes from.
Yeah, for sure. And briefly on the Chiefs, I mean, you mentioned how inconsistent they've been. They managed a 15-2 record, so I guess I understand. Wins is what matters the most in the NFL, of course. But for me, the way I have my bracket kind of set up right now, with Buffalo and Baltimore on a collision course, that would mean the Chargers are going to KC. KC Arrowhead, that's a hard place to win. I guess I'd pick the Chiefs just because of obviously they've been winning in the playoffs for years now. I just want to say though, we kind of touched on it earlier with Pittsburgh and Baltimore. Those two teams already split their season series. They know each other so well. This Chargers team is good enough to beat that Chiefs team. They didn't do it in the regular season, but I really think they could. I think they're tough enough. I think Herbert's a great quarterback, and listen, like the Chiefs don't exactly. Besides Kelsey, there's no weapon on the Chiefs that's like clearly above anyone on the Chargers. You could even argue that Lad McConkey and J.K. Dobbins have played better than anyone in the Chiefs running back and receiving room this season. Besides Rashid Rice the first 3 weeks before he got injured. So that's all I'm saying. I would probably still pick the Chiefs if we had to really discuss that game at length, just because of Arrowhead, because Mahomes and Reed, but I just want to put that out there that I'm not ruling out a Chargers AFC Championship trip at all. But kind of looking at our Super Bowls, just to wrap up here. So we can start with yours. Bills versus Lions. Who you got in that game?
I think probably the Bills. I
Really?
just think
Okay.
that just the fact that their defense isn't as banged up, and I think that's what it really comes down to in the Super Bowl is that obviously both teams they're good offensive teams, but I think in Super Bowls it really comes down to your defense. I mean, like if you look back at like Super Bowl 50 with the Broncos and the Panthers,
Mm,
the Broncos couldn't hold the jockstrap of the Panthers offense, but because their defense was so good, it didn't matter. They were able to sustain them enough, and it gets tricky. So I think, especially when you have so many defensive injuries, and especially Josh Allen, who's been playing lights out this year, I think it's a tough matchup for them. And although I'd love for the Detroit to win the Super Bowl, I think this year might not be their year, just because there's just a lot of injuries going on, and I think the Bills are just a really well-rounded team. And yeah, I think they're probably the most well-rounded team in terms of offensively and defensively, keeping everything in line. So
yeah, I think that's how I would lean too if it goes that way. But I do think the Eagles. I think the Eagles would beat the Bills in a Super Bowl. I just think there's something to be said about the fact that the Eagles not only do they have so much elite talent, but it's producing right now. Where the Bills defense, I'm not sure it would hold up for 4 quarters against the Eagles.
that's fair.
However, I don't know. The Bills have a lot of things that are working really well right now, though. Their offense has been like Allen is on a heater. He's been on a heater pretty much all season. Their offensive line is great. But you could say the same thing about the Eagles, except like Allen is clearly the better quarterback. That could once again with Hurts. Like Hurts has been good, but he needs to be great if they're going to beat Detroit. He needs to be great if they're going to beat Buffalo. I just think the rest of that Eagles team is so great that they can bring that out of him during the playoff run. I think he has it in him. He came close against the Chiefs and the 49ers that year. I think the Eagles have one more Super Bowl championship of this like current, like it's a much different team than 2017, but it kind of feels like it's somewhat the same era. There's a couple players still lingering around just in this long span of the Eagles. I think they can get one more Super Bowl out of it. And I think they do it this year. I think they beat Buffalo, and I think they get their franchise's second Super Bowl championship.
I think it really just comes down to how they play against Detroit. I think me personally, I'd pen in Buffalo as being the AFC representative. I don't think they should lose to any other team on their side of the bracket, but I do definitely see where you're coming from with the Eagles. I would say they're definitely the second best. Me personally, I think the Lions just a little bit better, but I definitely get where your point comes from, and I think it'll be exciting between those three teams to see what happens.
Yeah, I think the Lions, Bills, and Eagles. I mean, if you look at my power rankings I put on Twitter, those have been my three teams for pretty much most of this season. So I definitely think it will be one of those three. I'd be stunned if the Super Bowl winner wasn't one of those three. So we'll have to see how it all plays out. you did a great job, unbiased, picking the Bills to win the Super Bowl. Me, I'm just rooting on the downfall of the Lions and the Vikings. So, you have much more journalistic integrity here than I do. But nonetheless, thank you guys so much for tuning in to the Fan Committee's NFL playoff predictions. It was a lot of fun finally getting back on the pod. We'll have to see how it all plays out. Maybe the Packers will surprise me and make my day, but I think it's much more likely the Eagles take it home. So thank you so much for watching. Enjoy the playoffs.